how do we lobby or whatever, educate politicians who come up with all of these खटाखट 1 lakh रुपए आ जाएंगे?
That's a question I have to ask you. This graph I think is a
Comparison with other countries.
Yes. Here on the x-axis is share of working age population amongst other poor or middle income countries. If you are on this side, it means you have a higher share of world population, which we know India has a 23% share. Y-axis is what is the share of low skill or labor intensive exports in the world. The higher you are on this graph, the higher your share of the world market.
Correct.
And India में हम ये सब करेंगे जहाँ पे कोई employment नहीं है.
और फिर हम jobless growth की रोना रोएंगे.
They have to work in agriculture. 46% of Indian workers work in agriculture.
Yes.
Agriculture is only 17% of the GDP. This you will get by saying, look, let people work at the wage that they want to work.
Namaste. This conversation that you're about to see is with a person called Rahul Ahluwalia. I am Calcutta, then went to US to study economics, came back and has founded an organization called Foundation for Economic Development. मैंने राहुल का आर्टिकल पढ़ा था मिंट में ऑन मिनिमम वेजेस. मेरा बैकग्राउंड है थॉमस सॉवेल, मिल्टन फ्रीडमैन, इन सब के व्यूज़ ऑन हाउ मिनिमम वेजेस आर वेरी हार्मफुल to a nation's progress, to lifting people out of poverty, to giving choices to people, workers, and so on and so forth. Not only markets, not only being harmful to markets. So invited him for this conversation, and hopefully there will be many more conversations with Rahul Ahluwalia. There aren't too many people who are talking economics, and educating Indians and our politicians जिनको सब खटाखट मुफ्त देना है. We are going to break this conversation into two parts. One is general economics on free markets, trickle down economics, Nordic countries की, the common refrain is that, oh, Nordic countries are doing so well, they have so much socialism, you capitalist people unnecessarily want to, income inequality को promote करते हो, and all of this nonsense is peddled all the time by an entire woke culture. So I'm going to break this conversation into two parts. One is on, like I said, general economics, and the second part is on minimum wages itself. We do a deep dive session. The video is quite long, about an hour and a half, and hence we're going to be splitting this up. This introduction is going to be in both the videos, so please enjoy. Hopefully you'll learn a lot. Please spread the video. Thank you. So, इसमें मुझे ये बताओ राहुल, they always talk about exploitation by the people, by who are in money or who run businesses and all of that. So they basically also say they want to curb exploitation.
Yes.
So
that's a fantastic question. This is the number one thing that we get, and it's a great intention again, right? Now, if you think about exploitation, right? Exploitation कैसे हो सकता है? Two ways. Okay. One is physically forcing somebody to work for you. कि आपने उनके सर पे बंदूक रखा एंड बोला कि अगर आपने ये काम नहीं किया मेरे लिए तो मैं उड़ा दूंगा आपको, ठीक है? दैट और स्लेवरी या इंडेंचर्ड लेबर, राइट? कि आप सिर्फ मेरे लिए काम कर सकते हैं, किसी और के लिए काम नहीं कर सकते. दिस फॉर्म ऑफ एक्सप्लॉयटेशन वी शुड प्रिवेंट एट ऑल कॉस्ट्स, राइट? सरकार शुड.
This is law.
But it is law. It is law. But that's what, when we talk about worker protection, right?
Yeah.
Worker protection, government has a role, and the role is prevent people from physically enslaving other people and forcing them to work for you. What is the second kind of exploitation? Now, very few people, when they say exploitation these days, have this in mind. Although, of course, slavery used to exist, right? But very few people are usually talking about the other kind of exploitation, which is उस वर्कर के पास कोई और चारा नहीं है.
करेक्ट.
दैट ओनली चॉइस दैट वर्कर हैज कि वो आपके पास आके काम करे, राइट? नाउ देयर आर अ कपल ऑफ फैलेसीज हियर, राइट? वन फैलेसी इज कि उस वर्कर के पास कोई और चारा नहीं है. एवरीबडी हैज सम ऑप्शन, राइट? What were they doing before you set up that factory, right? Like let's assume a village, okay? वहाँ पे लोग रह रहे हैं, राइट, उस विलेज के पास एक खाली फील्ड है, ओके, एम्प्टी बैरन बंजर लैंड. राइट नाउ व्हाट इज हैपनिंग इन दैट विलेज, लोग जाके खेत में काम कर रहे हैं, कहीं बटाई कर रहे हैं, किसी और शहर में जाके कर रहे हैं, राइट. वो जो खाली लैंड है वहाँ पे अ फैक्ट्री वांट्स टू कम इन एंड इट वांट्स टू पे वर्कर्स 12,000 रुपीज़ अ मंथ, राइट. ये जो बटाई का काम है, कहीं और किसी शहर में जाके काम है, वी नो ऑन एवरेज इट्स गेटिंग पीपल 8,500 रुपीज़, राइट. सो व्हाट इज दिस फील्ड, दिस फैक्ट्री कमिंग इन टू दिस फील्ड, ये जो खाली बंजर ज़मीन है, what does this do? It gives them an additional option. They decide कि मेरे को अभी हर जगह बाकी जगह 8,000 6,000 मिल रहा है, मैं अब जाके यहाँ पे काम करूँगा फॉर 12,000. वर्कर्स आर डिसाइडिंग. अभी आप आ गए कह रहे हैं इन वर्कर्स के पास कोई और चारा नहीं है, आप इनको 12,000 की जगह 15,000 दो. What does the factory do? It shuts down. Workers are back to, अब क्या हुआ है, आपने अब क्या किया, you have actually made their exploitation easier. पहले उनका कौन एक्सप्लॉइट कर रहा था, जो ठाकुर बटाई करता है या जो शहर में, राइट. यू हैव एक्चुअली, आपने उनके ऑप्शंस को रिड्यूस कर दिया है.
So yeah, there is this interesting concept that poverty is about lack of choices.
Yes, absolutely.
So the lack of choices of working also, and lack of choices. Yeah.
And so what does minimum wage do? Minimum wage does not improve your choices. This is
decrease.
It does not
This
take,
is the same thing you were saying about the job. कि
Exactly.
आपको 17,000 की ही जॉब मिलेगी, अब 12 नहीं मिल सकती, 8 नहीं मिल सकती.
8 नहीं मिल सकती, कुछ नहीं मिल सकता, राइट. इट एक्चुअली डजंट से कि ओ ये 12,000 वाला चॉइस था, ये चॉइस आपके पास अभी भी है बट अब वो 15,000 हो गया है. That's not what happens, right? In the real world what happens is, जो आपका ये 12,000 वाला चॉइस था वो चला गया है, राइट. जो 15,000 वाले चॉइसेस थे दे रिमेन, बट एनी वे दीज पीपल डिड नॉट हैव दैट चॉइस, राइट. उनके पास क्या था, बटाई था, उनके पास शहर में जाके 8,000 का काम करने का चॉइस था, उनके पास घर रहने का चॉइस था, बच्चे संभालने का चॉइस था. यू नो, you have not expanded or improved their choices, you have reduced their choices and you have made it easier for people to exploit them.
So by furthering capitalism, you're improving the choices that people have, even if there is purported exploitation, which means that some big factory guy coming and saying मैं इस काम के इतने ही पैसे दूंगा,
Right.
मैं इससे ज़्यादा नहीं दूंगा, करना है करो, नहीं करना कुछ और करो. But by the fact that you have at least allowed that person to come in,
Yes.
set up a factory, you have increased the choices that
Available.
people have.
Absolutely. No, see, and I wouldn't even say capitalism. Capitalism, you can just forget about capitalism.
हाँ जी.
All we have to say is, exploitation कौन डिफाइन कर रहा है? आप अपने मिडिल क्लास घर में बैठ के डिसाइड कर रहे हैं कि 12,000 रुपये एक्सप्लॉयटेशन है, राइट. वर्कर को आप बोलिए कि देखिए आपके पास अभी आपके पास जो चॉइसेस हैं वो हैं, ठीक है. वर्कर लव्स द आइडिया कि मेरी अभी जो चॉइस है वो रहे और सडनली एक्चुअली 15,000 रुपये मेरे को मिलने लग जाए. दैट्स अ ग्रेट थिंग इफ दैट एक्चुअली हैपन्स इन रियलिटी, श्योर. बट लाइक वी डिस्कस्ड अर्लियर, दैट्स मैजिकल थिंकिंग, राइट. A worker does not suddenly become worth 15,000 because the law says the worker is worth 15,000, right? And people will make their choices. जो businessman है, he will not suddenly start thinking, oh I can start taking a loss. मैं apparel की stitching कर रहा हूँ, जहाँ से आपने बोला उसमें EBITDA मेरा 3-4% है और मेरी wages which are 25% of my cost suddenly jump up by 50%. I'm a loss making enterprise. वो चला जाए, वो बंद कर देगा, अपना फैक्ट्री बंद कर देगा, राइट. व्हाट हैपन्स टू द वर्कर, देयर चॉइसेस रिड्यूस, दे बिकम मोर एक्सप्लॉइटेबल, राइट. सो माय आर्ग्यूमेंट इज दैट जेन्युइन एक्सप्लॉइटेशन हैपन्स इफ यू आर फिजिकली फोर्स्ड टू डू समथिंग. इफ यू चूज टू डू समथिंग, दैट मीन्स इट इज़ बेटर देन द अदर ऑप्शंस यू हैव अवेलेबल टू यू. अगर आप आके फैक्ट्री में काम कर रहे हैं, राइट, it may look very bad to us, you know, फैक्ट्री में वर्किंग कंडीशंस खराब हैं, पे कम है, all of these things are true. But for that worker in that circumstance, it is the best option available to them. आप कह रहे हैं ये ऑप्शन भी हटा लो, right? Because again, अगर आप कह रहे होते कि, and this is the other example, कि मैं from the state exchequer will give a wage subsidy, right? कि मैं उनको मैं ये नहीं डिक्लेयर करूँगा कि आप हायर नहीं कर सकते, मैं कहूँगा मैं इस वर्कर को पीएफ में सरकारी पैसे से 3,000 रुपए और दूंगा. That's a different argument. Wage subsidy is a different argument.
आपको करना है आप करिए.
Which is also not a great idea, but that's a different argument, right? It's a different thing, right? So we can get to that either now or later, whatever, right? But it's a different argument. But at least that argument is not reducing the choices available to the worker. A minimum wage, a maternity benefit law, a mandated XX overtime, mandated सिर्फ 8 घंटे काम कर सकते हो दिन में, 10 घंटे नहीं कर सकते. All of these laws that say हम वर्कर को प्रोटेक्ट करेंगे are reducing the choices of the worker. They are increasing the chances that somebody will exploit that worker. And this is what we observe in the real world, right? If we apply the real world test, right, and we can look at some graphs, etc., that show us why this is the case.
Let's actually do that.
Sure.
Let's actually get to the graphs.
Sure.
And then I want to come back to the question of how do we lobby or whatever, educate politicians who come up with all of these खटाखट 1 lakh रुपए आ जाएंगे.
That's a question I have to ask you, not for you to ask me. But like, yeah.
Or okay, but we can go to maybe other aspects of Chidambaram saying we'll inevitably become an economy. I want to talk about a little bit about Raghuram Rajan.
Absolutely.
But let's go to the graphs first. Okay, Rahul.
Yeah.
So the graphs.
Yeah. So just to connect it to what we were saying earlier, right? I think we came at this from the idea that the assumption lying on minimum wage is that अगर आपने किसी को बोल दिया कि 12,000 की जगह आप 15,000 शेयर करिए, पे करिए अपने वर्कर्स को, तो उनके पास कोई ऑप्शन नहीं है. They have to pay the worker 15,000 or worker will be benefited.
Correct.
This is the core assumption. And we are saying no, businesses have lots of options. It is not true that अगर आपने किसी को बोल दिया कि 12,000 देना तो 15,000. So what should we expect अगर आपने लेबर को बहुत एक्सपेंसिव कर दिया है इंडिया में, and we are a labor abundant country, right?
Yes.
The core expectation should be that labor intensive industries, the kind of industry that uses labor more, should be growing faster in our country, right?
Correct.
And what are these industries? Typically these industries are apparel, right? These industries are leather, food products, wood or paper related industries. And we should expect that these industries should be growing a lot faster. Right?
Because we are labor intensive.
Because we are a labor abundant country.
And so absolutely.
We have more labor than anything else, right?
Yes.
And we are a relatively poor country, so we have less money, less capital.
Yeah.
So we should expect capital intensive industries like auto manufacturing, chemical manufacturing, plastic manufacturing, metal manufacturing.
Which are also less labor.
They are very less labor intensive, right? Very less. And just to give you an example, right? In apparel manufacturing, अगर आपको एक $1 billion का export करना है, you have to hire 1 lakh people. Right? This is what labor intensity means.
Okay.
आपके पास 1 लाख employees होंगे, तब जाके आपका $1 billion का revenue होगा. In something like chemical manufacturing, you can do $1 billion with less than 1,000 people.
Oh my God.
Right? That is what labor intensity means. आपके पास आपकी एक फैक्ट्री, बहुत बड़ी फैक्ट्री, जिसमें आप 500-600 लोग को एम्प्लॉय करते हैं, that can produce $1 billion of export, right? That's that. So we should expect जहाँ पे, but we have so many people, we should be employing more people, right?
So all this narrative that goes around about jobless growth and everything. Correct. And so we'll probably come back to that also.
So now what does this graph show?
Yeah,
right?
okay.
यहाँ पे x-axis पे है growth of the industry. So अगर आप ज़्यादा इस तरफ पे हैं, that means you are growing faster.
Okay.
Yeah, you're growing more. Y-axis पे labor
from 2009 to 2018.
Yes.
What is the growth of the industries between this period
of that sector,
9-10 years?
Right? Yeah. Y-axis पे we have labor intensity. The higher you are in this graph, जितना आप ऊपर जा रहे हैं, उतनी आपकी labor intensity ज़्यादा है. Apparel को देखेंगे सबसे ऊपर.
Apparel is actually one of the most labor intensive.
Like we discussed, right? Classic, most labor intensive. And I think once I've explained that, you can see, right? जितना ऊपर आप ज़्यादा हैं, उतनी आपकी growth कम है.
हाँ, because they अगर इसमें growth होती, then your graph would have been here.
Exactly right.
So we are not growing.
We are not
across
growing.
These 9 years, there's been very slow growth.
And we are talking these 9 years just for convenience. If you go back,
it's
same story, right? So if you look at the more capital intensive stuff, chemicals, auto, basic metal, ये सब इधर है, right? So in India, people are choosing to grow industries that are more capital intensive, right? So this jobless growth thing.
The way to visualize also this would be that if there was a timeline and a moving graph,
Yeah.
you would have seen these industries perhaps would have been here, and as the years progress, they actually started moving here.
They become bigger, and these industries will stay here.
Yeah, exactly.
These
and
industries
they
will stay
simply
here.
stay here.
They would just stay here
and
They
maybe
wouldn't
move little bit,
हाँ,
ting,
यहाँ
ting,
पे,
ting,
correct,
ting. Yeah.
correct.
Yeah.
Exactly. So these industries are pulling ahead. That's one way to think about it. Let's go back to the previous graph. We can argue, people can argue, कि ये तो ये सब जगह हो रहा होगा or whatever, right?
Exactly. Yes.
This graph, I think, is a
Comparison with other countries.
yes. This graph is a very important graph. I think we should be very this should really tell us something, right? Here on the x-axis is share of working age population amongst other poor or middle income countries, right? So rich countries को छोड़ दिया है.
ठीक है. So non-high income countries, but you've included China.
China
which
is
still,
yes.
Yeah.
Now it's a middle income, almost high income country, but we've included China. So what does this mean? If you are on this side, it means you have a higher share of world population, which we know India has a 23% share of world working age population. China has a slightly higher share of world working age population, 24%. So अगर आप इस side में हैं, that means you are high in the share of world population.
Sure.
So India and China are showing up there. Y-axis here is very interesting. Y-axis is what is the share of low skill or labor intensive exports in the world. So मान लीजिए how much of apparel exports is India doing, right? Or Vietnam doing, or Bangladesh doing. How much of हाथ का काम, handicraft, etc. So low skilled stuff. Again, the expectation should be कि अगर आपके पास ज़्यादा population है, your share should be
Share of the market should be higher.
higher, right? Exactly. So the higher you are on this graph,
Yeah.
the higher your share of the world market.
Correct.
Right? And I think
And what this is showing is that Vietnam,
Yes.
with a far lesser working population,
yes,
is almost at the same level as India
in the share of market.
in the share of market.
Exactly right.
And even Bangladesh is not far behind.
Bangladesh is not far behind at all, right? And actually, I think this is a slightly old graph, 4-5 साल पुराना है. By now, they might well have pulled ahead.
They would have probably gone up and
That's
been
right.
much more over.
That's right. So, and this really tells us, and if you look at all of the other small, China of course is way above. So they have 24% of the world working age population, but approximately 45% of the world's exports in sort of labor intensive exports. Vietnam, like you correctly say, it should be shocking for us. Vietnam's total population is 110 million or so. It is the same, it's smaller than Maharashtra as a state, right? And in terms of land area, I think it's the size of Rajasthan approximately. And in labor intensive exports, they are about the same size as India, and today again they're probably higher. Even total exports Vietnam is higher. But आप ये देखिए और भी जितनी छोटी छोटी countries हैं, they are all doing better. Why are they able to do better? Because we are doing so badly. And this comes back to a question you had asked me earlier, is this because of minimum wage? It is not because of only minimum wage, but it is because of this general philosophy that laws protect workers, especially these kinds of laws that make the worker more expensive than the worker wants to be. Now what happens is, the worker is more expensive than Bangladeshi workers, our worker is more expensive than Vietnamese workers, right? Not from a wage perspective, right? But from a legal perspective. Wage, we are actually earning much lower wages than Vietnamese workers earn, right? But the law says कि आपको ज़्यादा देना.
So when the law says that, companies like the companies in the apparel business,
they go to Vietnam.
They go to Vietnam and do this work, and textiles, leather सब वहाँ से करवाएंगे बांग्लादेश.
And India में हम ये सब करेंगे जहाँ पे कोई employment नहीं है.
और फिर हम jobless growth की रोना रोएंगे.
Exactly. So who suffers? It's the worker that suffers. क्योंकि उनके पास क्या होता है? It's not like आपने minimum wage कर दिया और ये companies यहाँ पे नहीं आई तो उनका बहुत बढ़िया हो गया. No, they have to work in agriculture. 46% of Indian workers work in agriculture.
Yes.
Agriculture is only 17% of the GDP.
When you want to get into, when there is this whole narrative of taking away people from agriculture and bringing them into industry,
manufacturing, yes.
then this is the wrong place to bring them in. This is the place you want to bring.
And how will you get this? This you will get by saying, look, let people work at the wage that they want to work.
Whatever these guys decide, give it 20 years and probably this will all shift.
Move. Absolutely. Because see, if you let the worker decide, as long as there's no gun to their head, they will pick what is best for them, right?
Let them work in. अगर उनको agriculture
अभी
खेती करनी है
agriculture
करें,
खेती
no
कर
problem.
रहे हैं, right? If they are deciding कि चलो नहीं मैं खेत से जाके फैक्ट्री में काम करूंगा, they are deciding, no, they are saying कि ये मेरे लिए बेटर है. आप कौन होते हैं कि डिसाइड करने वाले कि फैक्ट्री नहीं, खेत में काम करना है, धूप में, तपती धूप में पीठ तोड़ के करते रहो. फैक्ट्री नहीं, जब तक 15,000 नहीं मिलेंगे तब तक आप फैक्ट्री में घुस नहीं सकते. 12,000 के लिए मैं अलाउ नहीं करूंगा आपको. That's what you're saying. That's what a minimum wage is saying.
That's exactly what you're saying. And you were talking about laws. So, Smita here asked this question, exploitation. But what about exploitation in Vietnam, being sweatshops and all, right? And then now they have laws that if you have a sweatshop, Walmart won't buy so much and stuff like that. You have to prove on ESG ratings and so on and so forth. That's come in. So, is that a bad comparison to compare with Vietnam?
No, I think it's a great question. There is a lot of concern about sweatshops, and right, that is what motivates a lot of these laws, right? Ki we don't want them to be in sweatshops. We don't. But I think this goes back to the two forms of exploitation we spoke about earlier, right? One is the form of exploitation where somebody is physically forcing you to be in a job and stay in that job, right? And the second is, do you have a better option than this job, right? Now, my claim is on the first, we should raise worker protection as high as we can. Nobody should be ever able to force someone to stay in a job if they don't want to stay in that job, right? That should not be allowed ever, right? And that automatically, I think, gets you into a position where आप आके फैक्ट्री खोल रहे हैं, sweatshop है, right? The worker is trying to decide कि now most women in labor intensive industries, mostly it's women, right? What are the options that women have, right? Typically, India में देख लीजिए आप किसी, right? किसी village में अगर आप typical woman will have the option of खेती जाएंगे या घर पे काम करेंगे, right? Worst case, there'll be some construction site or something, वहाँ जाके काम करेंगे, right? These are their options.
Yes.
If to these women a factory opens up which is a sweatshop, right? कि आपको जाना है, we don't like those conditions.
Yes.
For that woman, she is deciding that this is a better option for me.
Yeah.
आप कौन होते हैं बोलने वाले कि no, because it is a sweatshop, this option is not good enough for you. मैं बोलूँगा.
Correct.
If the woman decides मुझे यहाँ काम नहीं करना, you should back her up with all force possible. Police should stop. The businessman should be arrested if they're holding a gun to that woman's head or otherwise forcing her कि तुम्हें यही काम करना है. Right?
Comes back to the same point that poverty is
a lack of choices. It's a lack of choices.
Yeah.
If an additional choice is being given, let the person decide. You cannot decide कि sweatshop ठीक नहीं है, जाके घर में बच्चे का ध्यान रखो या जाके खेत में काम करो, right? Correct. The खेत is worse for many people.
And by extending that, Rahul, and for the audience, and Milton Friedman talks about this, that, let free markets compete. If one company is not giving the best environment for workers, by the fact that you are enabling more markets to flourish, these same workers will go work somewhere else.
The best protection for a worker is for them to have better options.
More choices,
right?
That so you have to have an enabling system which creates more choices.
More choices, correct. And that's what if you're making the worker more expensive, we are reducing their choices, not increasing their choices.
So
right?
actually the answer then to get into a job growth market or to increase jobs, you actually would have to encourage encourage this, but
let me say
reforming these
don't
areas.
Discourage these guys. Let me put it that way. Right now, what are we doing? We are discouraging them. We are saying,
by putting all these laws in place.
We are saying the worker wants to work. You want to set up a factory. I am going to come in and say, no, you can't do it, right? Because the worker wants to work at 12,000. That's not good enough. You have to pay the worker 15,000. You say, okay, I'll go to Bangladesh, right? And what does this do? This doesn't give the worker a 15,000 job. It gives the worker an 8,000 job because that's their only current option.
वापस खेती में आके बैठ जाएगा, वो business कहीं और जाके करेगा, वो अपना business फिर भी कमाएगा, which is free markets and we can't avoid it.
100%.
You were also talking about some laws. You were alluding to firing people and all. Can you talk about that in some of these?
Sure. So The idea is that
existing laws in India.
the idea is that minimum wages is not the only way in which we make labor expensive, right? We have a whole host of protections, and again motivated by good intentions, right? That we want workers to be working in nice factories. We don't want workers to be fired without cause. We don't want workers to be doing overtime without sufficient remuneration. But everywhere we decide we have a set of standards. As long as you meet those standards, you can't operate, right? Combined with minimum wage, all of these things end up saying you cannot improve step by step, right? You cannot move from agriculturing into a job that is slightly better but not as good as the middle class wants your job to be, right? Or the politician wants your job to be. So ultimately what happens? Again, workers get hurt.
Yeah.
In India, like we were discussing, right? 46% of workers are still in agriculture, right? Yeah. Only 30% or so of women work at all, right? If you have to compare, and so in 1991, we started with 62% or so of people in agriculture, right? And China, when they started their reform, right? They started with approximately 75 or so percent of...
Much worse than us.
Much worse than us. In 30 years, they had moved that down by more than half, right? So in 30 years after they started their reforms, Chinese labor force participation in agriculture was less than 30%, right? So उन्होंने 35 percentage points कम कर दिया था. We have only been able to move our labor force out of agriculture 15 percentage points in 30 years, right? So it just shows like people are just struggling and suffering more because we have these noble intentions that they should not work in sweatshops, they should not work in minimum wage or lower than minimum wage.
Yeah.
Noble intentions.
Or
but
firing laws, for example.
Or
I think you were alluding to 100 लोग से ऊपर है तो
government approval चाहिए होता है
fire करने के लिए
किसी भी worker को, right? If your factory has more than 100 workers, if you want to fire a worker, मान लीजिए आपका business काम करना बंद कर दिया, you can't fire somebody without taking government approval from the labor commissioner. No labor commissioner is ever going to.
Correct, exactly. No, well.
They will
approve actually. Correct. They will say, hey, goose.
Correct.
My palm.
So exactly. So what happens is you don't hire workers to start with, right? Which is why these industries don't.
You will force the business to stay at 95, 90, whatever.
So these industries don't
hack the whole system.
Correct.
Make more companies here and there to hack the whole system. So in the end, it's not only this, but the whole environment of corruption increases all over.
So one set of doubts that comes up, right, is how do you strike a balance for worker protection and how does that work? And the second set of questions is, I think informal industries, etc., are very exploitative. How will regulations impact them, etc., right? Or why not further regulate them? And I think, so let me start with the second one first and we can go back to the first one. I think how do you prevent exploitation? We spoke about it, is by giving people better choices, right? And if there is a lot of exploitation going on, for instance, of agricultural labor, right? Like in a village, the local Thakur just has more power, right? And
so if Smita's example of pre-war explosion of business in post-war explosion of business in US were to be taken, and high suicide rates among workers and all of that. So basically, instead of more laws to protect the worker, the focus of the government actually should be on expanding the business so that the workers have more choices.
Absolutely.
Compete amongst each other, businesses compete amongst each other for better working conditions.
Absolutely.
That is a better answer rather than...
And you can come to this whole agriculture exploitation or local industries like carpet making, or we used to hear these Shivkasi matchmaking and fire workers, they're exploiting children, etc., right? So yes, the children are being exploited, right? How will they get a better answer for their lives, right? Is if you allow them a better option for their livelihoods, right? Not by demanding that whatever economics allows this exploitation should suddenly change, right? अब वो जो आपका गांव का ठाकुर है, आप उसको बोलोगे कि आप इस एग्रीकल्चरल लेबर को 15,000 रुपए दो, राइट? दैट्स द क्लियर थिंग. यू शुड से चलो एक्सटेंड दिस टू द ठाकुर. ठाकुर विल से मैं ट्रैक्टर खरीद के कटाऊंगा, राइट? लाइक इन द यूएस फॉर इंस्टेंस, everything is mechanized, right? What happens to this person who was doing agricultural labor now? अब वो mechanized हो गया उसका agriculture. You have said, I have solved exploitation by saying you must pay the worker more. No, what happens is the worker will end up earning less, right? Because you are disallowing them the best option they have right now. Again, right, the assumption always is by introducing a law, आप वो option जो उनके पास है उसको improve कर रहे हो. What you're actually doing, you're taking away that option, right? I think this is the important thing, that assumption कि आप अब पहले वो 8,000 कमा रहे थे, exploitative था, अब वो 15,000 कमाएंगे, ये exploitative नहीं होगा. That's not what happens, right? पहले वो 8,000 कमा रहे थे, अब आप कहोगे कि वो आप 8,000 भी नहीं कमा सकते. That is what actually happens, right? Because suddenly you're not going to start paying somebody 15,000 for something that is only worth 8,000 to you.
Yeah.
You will say, I'll find another way to do it or I won't do it, right? We can look at some of these reviews of evidence, right? Like, but these are very academic reviews, right? So,
but you know, one would
abhi
argue...
tak we've been talking theory, right?
Correct, yeah.
So these are empirical reviews, empirical papers, which say, okay, look, actually what happens when you focus. So I'll just take you through one by one. This I'll come to last. So this was a review that happened in 2006. Now here's the thing, right? So until the early 90s or so, if you were to ask economists, there would be a huge consensus on the idea that minimum wages causes harm in exactly the kind of ways we've been discussing, right? It hurts the least skilled people the most. It hurts the people with the least experience, the least advantages. Almost any economist, I think there was a survey and 90% of economists agreed. Then in the early 90s, there was a set of papers by a now Nobel winning economist. He just won the Nobel a couple of years ago, I think, that argued that actually minimum wages do not cause disemployment, right? They said there are specific things and they did a small study. So there was a lot of churn in the profession, lots of papers, all of that. So I think it's important to clarify that, that there are people. So I think always it's important to look at the balance of evidence, right? Like somebody will give some evidence, somebody will give some evidence. So these are two reviews that I'll point out here. One review in 2006 that look at sort of all the studies, right? And they say that of 100 studies, 2/3, which is 66%, and then they look at the quality of studies. So which ones are the better studies? 85% of the most convincing ones found consistent evidence of job loss effects on low-skilled workers.
Which is exactly what has happened with Black Americans in the US, according to Thomas Sowell as well.
Yes.
And maybe we could insert a video and show it to the audience.
We'll do that. So the idea is that this review finds this very specifically. So, and these are just clear examples of this. But the idea is that people who are doing worse are affected more badly by a minimum wage change, right? So that's consistent with everything that we were talking about. Next is, so if you might say, 2006, 2007 is slightly old. There's a review from 2022. One of the authors is the same, one author is different. But it is, again, the evidence is exactly the same. That employment reduces, right? This evidence is stronger for teens and young adults as well as for the less educated, again, right? So people who struggle to find jobs early in their career, less productive, they are the ones who have the most impact on their employment. It reduces, right? Their employment reduces, their chances in life reduce. This is, I think, all I, but just reiterates
isn't
that
actually true? Because all the manufacturing has moved away from US.
Yes.
And it is for similar reasons, right?
Yeah, I mean, I won't say it's just minimum wage.
No, fair enough.
Yeah,
but
it's that many more even lower wage workers are now available in the world, in China, in Vietnam. And
okay.
So, I mean, but that's the economics. That's what you would expect, right? The only thing this would have done, the minimum wage laws in the US would have done, is accelerate that move, right? Even people who want to...
Even labor unions.
Correct, labor unions absolutely have accelerated
detrimental
that move.
Effect
very detrimental effect on employment in manufacturing in the US, absolutely. So now, but here let me pause and say that there are many disagreements on this evidence, right? Like, so even though the reviews very strongly say this, some people will say, oh, these people are agenda hai, advocacy hai, all of that.
वहाँ Nobel Prize मिला है
Yeah,
इसलिए.
correct. So one relatively very new paper which is on the next slide is a random control trial. Right now, the general agreement amongst people, I don't necessarily agree with this point of view, but the general agreement is that random control trials give you the best quality evidence. They are like the gold standard जो medicine test करने के लिए आप use करते हैं. That is a random control trial. Interestingly, someone in 2017 was able to do a random control trial on minimum wage. नहीं this slide. Yeah. So this person, there was an online platform, right? जहाँ पे people are trying to do work, right? Contracts get pushed up. They say ये काम कराना है मुझे इतना, and people bid. There are about 2 lakh people on that platform. One of these part-time work platforms, online wale. This guy said, okay, for 1/3 of firms, I'm going to just let things proceed. For 1/3 of firms, randomly I will insert a minimum wage, right? कि कुछ workers को, when they try to place their bid, that bid will be increased, right, to the minimum wage that we are setting, and it's not a very high increase, right? And we will see what happens, what is different, right? Does it actually, what I am saying, does that actually happen? And absolutely clear, right? Hours worked fell, so by as much as 30%, right? So जो minimum wage के पास है, so those jobs reduced, employment reduced, right? The employees facing the minimum wage, they hired greater workers with greater past earnings, higher rates, and higher past average
People
wages.
who were highly skilled, better skilled,
Correct, got
better
higher,
off, got higher pays.
Exactly, right? And
The rest of them actually fell
got lower pay. Exactly, right? So he is very interesting. He also did a country-wise analysis, and the countries,
Same results.
yeah, so
Same results.
US workers saw an increase in hiring, workers from India and Bangladesh saw a decrease in hiring. And nobody knows where the worker is from, but you can assume that US workers will have better education background, more productivity, just from speaking the language more fluently or whatever it is. So I think the evidence, is incontrovertible, right? Like if you see these micro evidence papers, the results are in the same direction as you would expect. If you see the macro evidence that we were talking about earlier in those graphs, right? कि India में कम employment है, there is less switch away from agriculture, it's in the same direction as you would predict. So I think from a labor analysis, I think the evidence is very, very strong that making labor more expensive than it wants to be is a bad idea. So minimum wage is a bad idea, excessive labor protections, etc. are a bad idea. I think the evidence is very strong. I don't think you can reasonably hold disagreements, honestly, on this, right? I think it's just very, very strong. And I think if you expand your view slightly more, right, labor is a particular kind of market, but you should expect this from any market that you know about, मैं आपको बोल दूंगा कि आप कोई और प्रोडक्ट खरीद रहे हो, फ़ोन खरीद रहे हो, आप 20,000 के लिए फ़ोन नहीं खरीद सकते, मैं फ़ोन का चार्ज, मिनिमम फ़ोन चार्ज है 50,000 या 1 लाख. People will buy fewer phones, right? Labor works in exactly the same way. It works in exactly the same way, right? I am arguing कि आप किसी को employ नहीं कर सकते, इस पे करो. So we should not expect it to be different, and it is not different. I think all the evidence shows it's not different.
I have to admit that we have very poor human resource and skill development. This thing, one of the poorest.
Yes.
So wouldn't that be couldn't that be developed as one of the main this thing that, for instance, the traditional industry, it is an industry which can, so no matter how much they increase today a patola sari is costing 2 lakh rupees, maybe 30 years back it was 30,000 rupees. You cannot stop it because you know that only that worker can make it.
Who is defining exploitative, right? That's my point.
Because we are calling it choice, but that's not really a choice.
Why do you think this, right? Again, they are in an exploitative situation.
Already, currently, they're in an agriculture industry where they're barely getting paid anything. है ना? So all you're doing by a capitalist system is creating another choice. Yes, the company wala may be exploitative for this farm laborer coming into and working in a factory. But what you've done is now instead of one exploitative situations, you've created two exploitative options for the person. Choose the better option.
Yeah, choose the better option.
By the system.
The worker thinks that this option is a better situation, even if you think that they are both exploitative, right? And I think that is the key insight, right? Sitting here in this room or sitting in the parliament, right? How does the politician know what is exploitative to that worker or to the worker in Haryana or to this worker or that worker, right? Nobody knows except that worker,
Yeah.
right? What is their situation? If they are deciding that a certain choice is better for me, let them decide that, right? You are saying, no, I will take that choice away from you. That is my core point. My core point is that this assumption that by introducing minimum wage, by introducing maternity benefits, by preventing people from firing, by mandating high overtime wages, the assumption behind all this is you are improving exploitative situations for workers or exploitative choices for workers. My point is that the theory and the evidence tells us that that assumption is incorrect. That assumption is incorrect. Instead of improving choices for people, you are reducing their choices and you are making it more likely that they will remain in an exploitative situation and not less likely.
So, instead of me diverting into many other topics of interest which we've already touched upon a little bit, maybe to conclude this part of the conversation, could I ask you for your opinion? One is government's intervention, and now there is this massive amount of wokeism. Generally, there's a lot of woke in the US which includes social activism, which also includes things like attacking sweatshops and so on and so forth. Part of this movement is also from the UN, United Nations, which I think, I don't know when, 1991, this is one of the, I want to basically take you to ESG. That's a non-governmental organization and being peddled across the world, and there are barriers being created for being able to set up businesses. Okay, and in my view, in my conversations with some ESG consultants, I've come to the conclusion that these are extremely harmful for India. You have 500 or more parameters across 20-30 categories on which you're measuring businesses on their social and governance, and gets into absurd things like diversity and DEI and all of that, which is just completely irrelevant for India. Do you have a view on this? I mean, one is government doing all these great intent bad jobs, screwing up the system, and the other is now non-governmental organizations, agenda driven sometimes good intent driven. Sorry.
Yeah, fair. No, I think what I will say is that I don't think ESG is market driven, right? I think if you look at ESG funds, there is a good set of research more lately, and I think they find that one, they don't perform as well as other funds, and in time you should expect them to just die out. And two, a lot of the funding for them comes from quasi-governmental organizations, right? So it's multilateral organizations which are all running on taxpayer money, right? And the problem with taxpayer money is that it can be spent very badly and for very long periods of time, right? So I think left to itself, I think one, I don't think ESG would prosper, but if government funding keeps going there, it can keep going for a long time, right? But the second thing, and I think this is the more important aspect, I think nothing has improved human welfare in the last 40 years like trade and movement of goods and production of goods and services to places which are cheaper, right? I think China has moved, estimates vary, but as close to 700 or 800 million people out of poverty, right? That is a staggering number. India has moved 350 million people out of poverty, out of abject poverty, right? Together, these two countries have moved 1 billion plus people out of extreme poverty. And almost the entire credit for this movement goes to businesses being able to move into these countries and produce in these countries. In India, it's more about services. So IT and all that has created wealth here. In China, it has been about manufacturing, right? And everything that we're doing by trying to place barriers to movement of trade, by placing barriers, allowing poor countries to trade with rich countries, we can do it in the name of environment, we can do it in the name of governance, we can do it in the name of being against sweatshops, right? Is going to harm poor people. If you say a business should not move from Europe to India because Indian workers are treated worse, Indian workers are suddenly not moving to a utopia in Europe, right? They are going to stay in situations again, right, that treat them even worse than that business would treat them. And it feels bad to us, right? The idea that a sweatshop is an upgrade. But I think...
but that's, you started with saying poverty is the natural order
of things, right? Poverty is the natural order of things. The sweatshop, unfortunately, may be an upgrade. The important thing is let the worker decide. Don't decide for the worker. If you try and decide for the worker suffers.
Thank you very much. We'll end on that note. Hope you enjoyed the session. If you have comments, please leave them in the video below, and hopefully Rahul can also come and engage and answer some of those questions. I'm really hoping that these conversations with Rahul Ahluwalia can continue on various topics, including go into competing ideas, say between RBI, ex-governors and current governor, the current direction of the two governments, UPA, and in the last 10 years of UPA, 10 years of NDA. I want to be able to go with him on some of these topics and many more. So I will continue the conversations with you, Rahul. Thank you very much.
Looking forward to it. Thank you.